I'll take care of all the paperwork. You don't need to worry about any of it. That's what my brother Thaddeus told me the week after our father's funeral, and for nearly 8 months, I let myself believe that was simply him being generous during a difficult time. I had no idea he'd been quietly sitting on a file the entire time that would eventually unravel everything I thought I understood about our family, our father, and the inheritance Thaddeus had already started spending long before I ever found out it existed. I'm Rosalind, 36, an occupational therapist, and Thaddeus is my older brother by 4 years, someone who'd always taken on the role of family organizer without much prompting, the one who remembered birthdays, coordinated holiday dinners, handled the logistics nobody else wanted to deal with. When our father, Bartholomew, passed away last spring after a sudden stroke, it felt natural, almost inevitable, that Thaddeus would step into handling the estate, the paperwork, the accounts, the property, while I focused on grieving and supporting our mother, who'd been gone herself for nearly a decade by that point, meaning Dad's passing left just the two of us to sort through everything. Our father had been a quiet, private man for most of his life, a retired civil servant who'd spent 30 years working for the city's planning department before retiring into a modest, unremarkable existence of gardening and crossword puzzles. He wasn't wealthy in any dramatic sense, a paid-off house, a decent but not extravagant retirement account, some savings, nothing that suggested any particular complexity when it came to settling his affairs. Thaddeus, being an accountant by profession, seemed like the obvious choice to manage the estate's finer details, and I genuinely appreciated not having to navigate probate paperwork and tax forms during the rawest weeks of grief. For the first couple of months, Thaddeus kept me reasonably updated, occasional texts about probate court dates, a brief conversation about listing the house, general confirmations that everything was moving along as expected. I trusted him completely, the way you trust a sibling you've never had serious reason to doubt, especially one who'd always been the responsible, dependable one throughout our entire lives. Around the 5-month mark, though, I started noticing small inconsistencies that initially seemed too minor to worry about. Thaddeus mentioned, almost offhand during a phone call, that he'd finally sold Dad's old car, something I hadn't realized was still sitting unsold in the garage months after the funeral. When I asked how much it went for, he gave a vague answer, something about not much, it was pretty old, and quickly changed the subject to something else entirely. Then there was the house itself. Dad's modest 3-bedroom place, the home Thaddeus and I had both grown up in, sat on the market for what felt like an unusually long time given how straightforward the sale should have been. No complicated liens, no structural issues that I was aware of, a decent neighborhood with reasonable comparable sales nearby. When I asked Thaddeus about the delay, he explained it away as a slow market, buyers being picky, nothing that struck me as particularly suspicious in isolation, though the explanations always felt slightly too smooth, too rehearsed for casual conversation. The moment that finally cracked my trust wide open happened almost by accident, 7 months after the funeral, when I stopped by Thaddeus's house to drop off some old photo albums I'd found while going through my own storage, thinking he might want them for his kids. He wasn't home, but his wife, Persimmon, let me in to wait, mentioning he'd be back within the hour from running errands. While waiting in his home office, glancing idly at the bookshelves, I noticed a filing cabinet drawer standing slightly ajar, papers visibly overflowing at the top in a way that seemed uncharacteristically messy for someone as organized as Thaddeus normally was. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled the drawer open a little further, intending only to straighten the papers so they wouldn't spill, when a manila folder labeled simply Dad, Private, slid partially out into view. I stood there for a long moment, hand hovering over that folder, some instinct telling me that whatever was inside had been deliberately kept from me, and that opening it now, uninvited, in my brother's own office, was crossing a line I couldn't uncross once I did. I opened it anyway. Inside the folder was a stack of documents that immediately struck me as far more extensive and complicated than anything Thaddeus had ever described to me over the past 7 months of estate handling. The first page was a life insurance policy statement, dated from nearly 15 years earlier, listing a payout amount that made my breath catch, for $100,000, an amount our father had never once mentioned in any conversation I could remember, and an amount that dwarfed everything Thaddeus had described to me as the modest, unremarkable total value of Dad's estate. I flipped further through the folder, hands slightly unsteady, and found bank statements from an account I didn't recognize, one that wasn't among the accounts Thaddeus had mentioned during our earlier conversations about consolidating Dad's finances. The statements showed regular, substantial deposits over the years, consistent with what looked like careful long-term saving rather than any kind of windfall building up to a balance, as of the most recent statement dated just 3 months after Dad's death, of just over $280,000. There was also, tucked toward the back of the folder, a handwritten letter in our father's unmistakable, careful cursive, dated about 2 years before he passed, addressed simply to my children. My hands were shaking properly now as I unfolded it, reading words our father had apparently written specifically anticipating this exact moment. His own death, and the eventual discovery of whatever secret this folder actually represented. The letter explained that the life insurance policy and the separate savings account had been building quietly for over a decade. Money our father had specifically set aside, separate from his regular retirement accounts and the house, intended to be split evenly between Thaddeus and me upon his death. He wrote about wanting to make sure we both had something meaningful to build a future with, mentioning specific hopes for each of us, that I might use my share toward finally opening the therapy practice I talked about for years, that Thaddeus might use his toward his own children's education, whatever paths made sense for each of us individually. Nowhere in that letter did our father suggest this money should be managed exclusively by Thaddeus, or that I shouldn't be told about its existence at all. In fact, the letter specifically stated, in his own careful handwriting, that both of us should be informed together, ideally by a lawyer handling the estate, to ensure the split happened fairly and transparently. I sat there in Thaddeus's office, folder open on my lap, feeling something cold and furious settle into my chest as the full implication became unavoidable. Thaddeus had known about this entire separate inheritance, an amount close to $700,000 combined, for at least 7 months, and had said absolutely nothing to me about it, instead maintaining the careful, ongoing fiction that Dad's estate consisted only of the modest, unremarkable assets he'd been slowly, methodically settling in front of me. I heard the front door open downstairs, Thaddeus's voice calling out something to Persimmon, and felt a rush of adrenaline as I quickly, carefully returned the folder to exactly the position I'd found it in, sliding the drawer mostly closed the way it had originally been, my heart pounding as I stood up and moved away from the filing cabinet just moments before Thaddeus appeared in the doorway of his own office. "Rosalind, hey, sorry I wasn't here when you arrived," he said, entirely unaware of what I just discovered, his expression open and easy in a way that suddenly struck me as almost obscene given what I now knew he'd been hiding. "Persimmon said you dropped off some photo albums. That's really sweet of you." "Yeah," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I actually felt, some instinct telling me I needed more information before confronting him directly. Needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before tipping my hand about what I'd found. "I figured you and the kids might want them. I should get going. Actually, I have an appointment I forgot about." I left his house that afternoon in a daze, driving several blocks before finally pulling over, hands still shaking on the steering wheel, trying to process not just the financial magnitude of what I'd discovered, but the deeper, more painful betrayal underneath it, that my own brother, someone I trusted completely for 7 months of grief and estate settling, had apparently been sitting on knowledge of an inheritance worth nearly $700,000, specifically intended for both of us without once mentioning its existence. Part 3. I sat in that parked car for almost 20 minutes before I felt steady enough to actually drive home, my mind cycling through every conversation Thaddeus and I had shared over the past 7 months, searching for moments where his careful, controlled explanations now took on an entirely different, more sinister meaning in light of what I just found. The slow house sale, the vague answer about the car, the general sense I'd occasionally had, quickly dismissed each time, that he was managing information rather than simply sharing it, all of it suddenly clicked into a coherent, deliberate pattern. Once I got home, I called my closest friend, Marceline, someone who'd worked in family law for almost a decade before transitioning into estate planning, hoping she could help me understand the legal reality of what I was actually looking at, separate from the raw emotional betrayal I was still processing. I described the folder in detail, the insurance policy, the separate savings account, the handwritten letter explicitly stating both of us should be informed and the money split evenly. "Rosalind, if what you're describing is accurate," Marceline said carefully once I'd finished, "this isn't just a sibling dispute. Your brother appears to have knowingly concealed assets that were legally part of your father's estate, or, at minimum, assets your father clearly intended to be shared according to a documented wish. Depending on how the accounts were titled and whether he's already accessed or spent any of that money, this could actually constitute a serious legal issue, not just a moral one." That last part landed hard, the accounts he'd already accessed or spent, and I found myself thinking back to small details from recent months. A new car Thaddeus had mentioned buying about 4 months ago. A family vacation to somewhere tropical that Persimmon had posted extensively about on social media just 2 months earlier. A home renovation project I'd noticed underway the last time I'd visited before that day. None of those things had struck me as suspicious at the time, simply normal life happening in my brother's household. But viewed now through the lens of what I just discovered, they suddenly read very differently. I think I need to actually confirm what's happened with that money before I confront him, I told Marceline. I don't want to accuse him of something without understanding the full scope first. That's smart, she agreed. If you can get any documentation, bank statements, anything showing withdrawals or account activity since your father's death, that would help clarify exactly what's happened. But Rosalind, I want to be honest with you. Based on what you've described, this doesn't sound like an oversight or a simple mistake. Sitting on a folder specifically labeled private for 7 months, while actively managing a narrative that made you believe the estate was much smaller than it actually is, that's a deliberate choice, repeated consistently over an extended period. I spent the following several days in a strange, suspended state, going through the motions of my normal life, seeing patients, running errands, all while carrying the weight of what I now knew and hadn't yet confronted Thaddeus about. I didn't want to make another move without more information, but I also felt an increasingly urgent need to understand exactly how much of that inheritance might already be gone, spent on cars and vacations and renovations while I remained completely unaware it had ever existed in the first place. I decided, after much deliberation, to reach out to the life insurance company directly, using Dad's information that I still had access to from earlier, more general estate conversations with Thaddeus. It took several calls and a fair amount of persistence navigating customer service, but I eventually confirmed something that made the entire situation feel even more deliberate and calculated than I'd initially understood. The policy had been paid out in full to the designated beneficiary within about 6 weeks of Dad's death, well before Thaddeus had ever told me the estate settlement was even properly underway, meaning he'd had access to that $400,000 for the vast majority of the 7 months he'd been carefully managing my understanding of a much smaller, more modest inheritance. I also managed, through some careful digging and a conversation with our father's longtime family lawyer, a man named Edgeworth who'd apparently drafted both the will and, separately, some kind of beneficiary designation on the insurance policy years earlier, to confirm that the policy had specifically named both Thaddeus and me as equal beneficiaries, not Thaddeus alone as I'd initially feared might be the case. Your father was very clear about this when we set it up, Edgeworth told me over the phone, sounding genuinely troubled once I explained the situation. He wanted to make sure both his children benefited equally from that policy, separate from whatever happened with the house and his regular retirement accounts. If your brother received that payout and hasn't informed you of its existence or shared any portion of it, that's a significant problem, Rosalind, both morally and potentially legally, depending on how things unfold from here. Sorry, part ad horare Gaia, let me complete Part 4 properly. 800-1000 words Part 4 armed with confirmation from both the insurance company and our father's own lawyer. I finally felt ready to confront Thaddeus directly, though I spent an entire weekend deciding exactly how I wanted to approach it, wanting to avoid an emotional, chaotic blow-up that might give him room to deflect or minimize what he'd done. I called him on a Tuesday evening and asked if we could meet in person. Just the two of us, somewhere neutral, mentioning only that I had some questions about the estate settlement I wanted to discuss properly rather than over the phone. We met at a quiet cafe 2 days later, and I watched Thaddeus's expression carefully as I laid out, calmly and methodically, exactly what I'd discovered, the folder I'd found in his office, the insurance payout I'd confirmed directly with the company, our father's own handwritten letter explicitly stating both of us should be informed and the money split evenly. I watched the color drain from his face as I spoke, his hands going still around his coffee cup, and by the time I finished, he sat there in silence for a long moment before finally speaking. I was going to tell you, he said, though the words came out weak, unconvincing even to his own ears from the way his voice wavered. I just needed time to figure out the right way to handle it. 7 months, Thaddeus, I said, keeping my voice level despite everything churning underneath it. You've had access to $400,000 from that insurance policy for 7 months. You bought a new car. You took a family vacation. You're renovating your house. Meanwhile, you've had me believing Dad's entire estate barely covered basic expenses. That's not needing time to figure out the right way to handle it. That's actively spending money that legally belonged to both of us while deliberately keeping me in the dark. He didn't have a good answer for that, just sat there looking increasingly uncomfortable, eventually admitting, in halting, defensive fragments, that he'd initially planned to tell me but had gotten overwhelmed managing everything, and that once some time had passed, telling me became harder, more complicated, something he kept putting off because he wasn't sure how to explain the delay without it looking exactly like what it actually was. "What about the savings account?" I asked. "The $280,000? Have you touched that too?" He admitted reluctantly that he'd moved about $30,000 from that account to cover some of his recent expenses, framing it, even now, as something he'd intended to account for properly, once he eventually told me everything, a justification that felt increasingly hollow with each new detail he revealed. I told him, plainly, that I'd already spoken with Marceline about the legal implications of what he'd done, and that I expected full transparency going forward, complete documentation of every withdrawal, every expense, and immediate arrangements to split whatever remained of both accounts according to what our father had explicitly outlined in his letter. I also told him I wanted the $30,000 he'd already spent accounted for and repaid from his own funds, separate from the remaining balance, since that money had never actually been his to unilaterally use in the first place. Thaddeus tried, over the following weeks, various approaches to soften what had happened, alternating between genuine-sounding remorse and moments of defensive justification, pointing out that he'd handled the bulk of the estate work, the probate paperwork, the house sale, as though the labor of estate management somehow entitled him to unilateral control over assets our father had specifically designated for equal sharing. I didn't accept that framing, and with Marceline's guidance, we ended up formalizing the entire situation through proper legal channels, working with Edgeworth to ensure the remaining balance of both the insurance payout and the savings account was split correctly, with Thaddeus required to document and repay the $30,000 he'd already spent from the shared savings account, an arrangement that took several more tense, difficult weeks of negotiation before finally reaching resolution. What struck me most throughout this entire process wasn't just the financial betrayal itself, significant as it was, but the deeper, more painful realization that Thaddeus had apparently been willing to let me grieve our father for 7 months while simultaneously managing a careful, deliberate deception about the true scope of what Dad had actually left behind, using the labor and appearance of responsible estate management as cover for what amounted to a sustained, calculated withholding of information that fundamentally wasn't his to control alone. The formal legal process of untangling everything took almost 2 months, working through Edgeworth's office to properly document the remaining balances, establish a clear repayment schedule for the $30,000 Thaddeus had already spent, and finally, officially, split what remained of both accounts according to our father's explicit wishes. During this period, my relationship with Thaddeus existed in a strange, strained limbo, occasional necessary communication about paperwork and logistics, but almost nothing resembling the normal sibling relationship we'd shared for the previous 36 years. Persimmon reached out to me once during this period, clearly aware that something significant had shifted between Thaddeus and me, though I got the sense she didn't know the full extent of what had actually happened. She invited me to lunch, and I accepted, curious whether she might offer some additional insight into how deliberately Thaddeus had actually planned all of this, or whether, like me, she'd been kept largely in the dark about the specifics. "He's been different lately," she admitted over lunch, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Stressed, distant. I know something happened between you two regarding your father's estate, but he hasn't given me many details, just that there was some kind of misunderstanding about the finances that you two are working through." I decided, after some internal deliberation, to be honest with her, not out of any desire to turn her against her husband, but because I felt she deserved to understand the actual situation rather than whatever softened version Thaddeus had apparently been offering at home. I explained the folder, the insurance policy, the 7 months of deliberate concealment, watching her expression shift from confusion into something more troubled as the full picture became clear. "The car," she said slowly, almost to herself. "He told me that was covered by a work bonus. And the renovation. He said we'd finally saved up enough for it after years of budgeting." She looked at me, something like genuine distress crossing her face. "Rosalind, I had no idea any of this money was connected to your father's estate." I thought we were finally just doing better financially through his own hard work and saving. I believed her, honestly, watching her process the same kind of betrayal I'd experienced weeks earlier, just from a different angle, realizing that her own husband had apparently been managing a careful set of explanations with her too, protecting the deception on multiple fronts simultaneously rather than just from me alone. That conversation with Persimmon ended up shifting something within their own household dynamics in ways I only partially witnessed secondhand over the following weeks. She confronted Thaddeus herself, apparently, about the discrepancy between what he'd told her and what had actually happened, and their relationship, from what little Persimmon shared with me afterward, went through its own significant strain as a result, Thaddeus having apparently constructed slightly different, equally misleading narratives for both the people closest to him. Around the 3-month mark since I'd first discovered that folder, the legal and financial resolution finally reached completion. The remaining balance of both accounts split evenly between Thaddeus and me. The $30,000 he'd already spent formally documented as a debt he was repaying in installments directly from his own separate funds. I finally received my share, an amount that, once everything settled, came out to just over $300,000 combined between both accounts. Money I genuinely hadn't expected to exist just months earlier. Money our father had apparently spent over a decade quietly setting aside, specifically hoping it might help build a meaningful future for both his children. I thought a lot, during this period, about the specific line from Dad's letter mentioning he hoped I might use my share toward finally opening the therapy practice I'd talked about for years. A dream I genuinely mentioned to him casually on several occasions but never expected him to actually remember with enough specificity to plan around. Reading that detail again, once everything financial had finally settled, hit me with a fresh wave of grief, different from the anger I'd been carrying toward Thaddeus, a purer, more straightforward sadness about how much thought and care our father had apparently put into planning for both of us, only for that careful planning to become tangled up in his own son's deception rather than unfolding the way he'd clearly intended. Once the financial resolution was finally settled, I found myself facing a harder, more complicated question that had nothing to do with money at all: whether I actually wanted any continued relationship with Thaddeus going forward, given the depth and duration of what he'd done. It wasn't a decision I reached quickly or easily, spending several months working through it, partly in individual therapy sessions I'd started attending specifically to process the entire ordeal, and partly through long, difficult conversations with Marceline, who understood both the legal and personal dimensions of everything that had happened. Thaddeus reached out repeatedly during this period, requesting meetings, sending messages that ranged from genuine-sounding apology to occasional, frustrating attempts to minimize what he'd done by pointing again to the labor he'd invested in handling the broader estate paperwork, as though that labor somehow offset 7 months of deliberate financial concealment. I found his inconsistency particularly difficult to navigate, some conversations leaving me with a flicker of hope that he genuinely understood the depth of the betrayal, others leaving me feeling like he still fundamentally believed he'd done nothing more than make an understandable, if regrettable, delay in communication. About 5 months after everything had legally resolved, Thaddeus asked if we could meet properly, without any pending logistics or paperwork attached, just to talk genuinely about what had happened and where things stood between us. I agreed cautiously, meeting him at the same cafe where I'd originally confronted him, a choice that felt intentional on both our parts, revisiting the site of that initial difficult conversation now that the immediate crisis had fully resolved. "I've had a lot of time to think about everything," he said, once we'd settled in. "And I know I've given you a lot of different explanations over these past months, some of them probably sounding like excuses even when I didn't mean them that way. I think the truth is I got scared initially seeing that insurance payout, and some part of me convinced myself that managing it quietly without immediately involving you would somehow make things easier, less complicated. I told myself I'd tell you eventually, and then every week that passed made the eventual conversation feel harder, until I'd built up months of silence that I didn't know how to break without facing exactly this kind of consequence. I listened, genuinely trying to give him space to explain himself honestly rather than immediately dismissing whatever he said. Though I noticed, even in this more vulnerable-sounding explanation, an absence of any real acknowledgement of the specific harm caused. The months I'd spent believing our father had left almost nothing behind, the grief I'd navigated without understanding I was simultaneously being deceived by the one person I trusted most to help me through it. "I appreciate you being more honest about the fear underneath it," I told him. "But I need you to understand something, Thaddeus. This wasn't a single moment of poor judgment. This was 7 months of active, sustained choices every single day to keep me in the dark, to spend money that legally belonged to both of us, to let me grieve our father under false pretenses about what he'd actually left behind. That's not something I can just move past because you finally offered a more emotionally honest explanation for why you did it. He nodded slowly, seeming to genuinely absorb that distinction in a way his earlier, more defensive conversations hadn't quite managed. I understand if you need distance, he said. I don't expect things to just go back to normal. I just wanted you to know I do understand now how badly I handled everything, and I'm genuinely sorry not just for getting caught, but for actually doing it in the first place. I told him honestly that I appreciated hearing that, but that rebuilding any kind of meaningful trust between us was going to take significant time, if it happened at all, and that I wasn't interested in rushing back into a normal sibling relationship simply because the financial and legal aspects of the situation had reached resolution. We left that conversation in a place that felt, for the first time in months, less overtly hostile, but still genuinely uncertain, both of us understanding that whatever came next would require sustained, demonstrated change rather than a single difficult, honest conversation. Over the following year, my relationship with Thaddeus rebuilt itself slowly, unevenly, nothing like the easy, automatic closeness we'd shared for most of our lives before Dad's death, but something more careful and deliberate, tested repeatedly by small moments where I found myself watching him closely, gauging whether his actions matched his words in ways I'd never felt the need to scrutinize before discovering that folder in his office. I used a significant portion of my share of the inheritance exactly the way our father had hoped, opening my own occupational therapy practice about 8 months after the financial resolution finally settled. A small clinic focused on pediatric therapy that had been a genuine, long-held dream I'd mostly assumed would remain theoretical given the financial barriers to starting an independent practice. Standing in that space on opening day, I thought about Dad's letter, his specific hope that this money might help me build exactly this kind of future, and felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief, wishing he'd been there to see it happen, wishing the money that made it possible hadn't come wrapped in months of betrayal before I ever got the chance to use it the way he'd intended. Thaddeus attended the opening, along with Persimmon and their kids, and I noticed him standing quietly near the back for much of the event, seemingly aware that his presence there carried its own complicated weight given everything that had happened in the months leading up to that moment. He found me toward the end of the event, offered a genuine, understated congratulations and mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd started seeing a therapist himself, working through what he described as some patterns that had led him to make the choices he'd made regarding Dad's estate. That detail, small as it was, mattered more to me than almost anything else he'd said or done in the months since our confrontation, evidence of actual, sustained effort toward understanding and changing rather than simply hoping enough time would pass that the whole situation might fade into something we both quietly agreed to stop discussing. Persimmon and I remained close throughout this entire period, our friendship, oddly, growing stronger through the shared experience of having both been deceived by the same person, even if our individual reasons for forgiveness or continued distance from Thaddeus looked somewhat different. She stayed with him, ultimately, working through their own version of rebuilt trust within their marriage, though she told me once, candidly, that the entire experience had permanently shifted how she approached financial transparency within their relationship going forward, insisting on joint visibility into every account, every significant purchase, a level of scrutiny she admitted felt exhausting sometimes but necessary given what she'd learned about her husband's capacity for sustained, careful concealment when he felt cornered by circumstances. I found myself, throughout that year, returning often to Dad's letter, rereading it periodically, not out of any lingering anger, that had mostly settled into something quieter and more manageable by that point, but because something in his careful, hopeful words for both his children continued to move me each time I encountered them again. He'd clearly spent years quietly building something meant to help both Thaddeus and me, imagining specific futures for each of us, therapy practice, children's education, without ever anticipating that his own careful planning would become entangled in exactly the kind of sibling deception he'd apparently tried to guard against by explicitly stating, in his own handwriting, that both of us should be informed together fairly, transparently. It's been almost 2 years now since I first found that folder tucked into Thaddeus's filing cabinet, and looking back at everything that's unfolded since, I find myself settled into an understanding of the entire experience that feels far more complicated, and honestly more forgiving, than I would have predicted possible during those raw, furious weeks right after the discovery. My practice has grown steadily over these past 18 months, now employing 2 additional therapists alongside myself, serving a genuinely meaningful number of families in the community. Exactly the kind of work I dreamed about for years before Dad's inheritance finally made it financially possible. I think about him often while I'm there, some quiet, private gratitude threading through the daily work of building something he specifically hoped I'd build, even knowing the path toward actually receiving that support turned out to be far more complicated than he ever could have anticipated. Thaddeus and I have settled into a relationship that's genuinely different from what we had before, less automatic and easy, but in some ways more honest, built now on the accumulated evidence of small, consistent choices rather than simple assumed trust. We see each other regularly again, family dinners, holidays, the ordinary rhythms of sibling life slowly reestablishing themselves, though I still notice, occasionally, a kind of careful watchfulness in myself that wasn't there before, a habit of paying closer attention to inconsistencies I would have simply overlooked in the past. I asked him once, about a year after everything had settled, whether he thought he would have eventually told me about the money on his own, without my accidental discovery forcing the issue. He sat with the question for a long moment before answering honestly. I've thought about that a lot, actually, in therapy mostly. I want to tell you yes, that I would have eventually found the courage. But honestly, I think the longer it went unaddressed, the harder telling you would have become, and I'm not entirely sure I would have ever actually done it if you hadn't found that folder yourself. I think, left to my own devices, I might have just kept finding reasons to delay it indefinitely. I appreciated that honesty more than I think he realized. The acknowledgement that whatever genuine remorse he'd developed since being caught existed alongside a clear-eyed recognition that the deception might well have continued indefinitely without the accident of my finding that drawer left slightly ajar during an otherwise unremarkable visit to drop off old photo albums. Marceline, who'd guided me through the entire legal process, told me once, during a conversation long after everything had formally resolved, that she'd seen many families torn apart permanently by exactly this kind of inheritance dispute. Siblings who never spoke again, relationships poisoned beyond any possibility of repair once money and deception became entangled together. She seemed genuinely surprised, in a good way, at how Thaddeus and I had eventually managed to rebuild something functional, if not quite identical to what we'd had before. I told her. The difference is that once I confronted him directly, with actual documentation rather than just suspicion, he didn't keep lying. He was defensive at first, gave some unconvincing excuses, but he didn't try to manufacture some elaborate counterstory or deny what the evidence clearly showed. That gave me something to work with eventually, even if it took a long time to actually trust it. I still keep a copy of Dad's letter, the original safely preserved with Edgeworth's office, but a photocopy in my own desk drawer at the practice, and I read it occasionally, especially on difficult days, drawing something steadying from his careful, hopeful words written years before he passed, imagining a future for both his children that he clearly hoped would unfold with honesty and fairness between us. It didn't, not entirely, not for those first difficult 7 months, but in the years since, working through the wreckage of that initial deception, Thaddeus and I have managed, slowly and imperfectly, to build something closer to what he actually intended, a relationship tested by genuine hardship but ultimately carefully rebuilt on more solid, more honest ground than either of us had quite realized we needed until the folder I found that afternoon forced both of us to reckon with exactly what honesty actually requires between people who claim to love each other.